very happy to be speaking to all of you at Herring Fest. Of course, herring are incredibly important to this coast. I came to British Columbia in 1984 to the Broughton Archipelago to begin a long-term study on the orca. I wanted to model a study after Dr. Jane Goodall's work and just live in their environment and study them over decades. In particular, I was interested in their acoustics. They're a large-brained animal living in the ocean, holding their breath, which is, of course, brains require a lot of oxygen. And so for an animal that's holding its breath, to have such a large brain was an indicator that they were using all of it. And it seemed to me that their sounds were the way to access, perhaps, the intelligence that was that occurred inside these brains. So I found the Broughton Archipelago, and it was the perfect place. It was so quiet. It was a tiny community of Echo Bay. It was very calm waters because of the number of islands, and there weren't the big currents that you see in many parts of the coast. The arrival of the herring in the spring was always anticipated. If I didn't anticipate it, I certainly knew about it very quickly as soon as the herring would move into the area, because suddenly there was a showing of birds, there were eagles, the sea lions showed up. It was a very dynamic event. So for somebody watching the environment and studying it, the arrival of the herring, although it was very hard to, of course, see them, you saw their whole contingent that went with them, all of their predators. We had herring of all sizes. This obviously is quite a large herring, being held by my friend Billy Proctor. It had bitten a hook that was out for salmon. It was so big. But we had the full complement of age classes. We had kilometers of spawn. My next door neighbor was working for Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, and it was his job, among other things, to assess the herring. That meant running his boat up and down the area with his sounder on, also going to the beaches where they were spawning and diving in and measuring how thick the spawn was and the spread of it and how deep it occurred. DFO knew herring were important. They spent a lot of effort assessing it throughout the coast. Of course, as you all know, the herring feeds so many species, and so of course it was important to our bird populations, our spring salmon, the Chinook. When the herring would arrive in Kinkum Inlet in April and May, the salmon fishing was just incredible. There's 30, 40-pound Chinook salmon were common. I was catching them, and I'm a mediocre fisherman at best. And so it was inescapable to see what an energy supply they were, how much they brought to the archipelago, how much depended on them. In 1966, this is a publication by the Fisheries Research Board of Canada. This was a government science-based group before the Pacific Biological Station. And it was remarkable in that it was independent of the politics of DFO, and it was considered one of the world's premier fisheries research organizations. And in 1966, they did a study on bycatch of salmon in the herring fishery. And part of this report looks at the impacts of lights. And so these pictures are very poor, quite old. But the boats were using very, very bright lights to attract the herring at night to increase their catch. And I took an excerpt of the report here, and it said the herring fishing may take place in day or night. Night fishing frequently involves the use of bright lights to concentrate scattered schools of herring. When lights were used in herring fishing operations, 3 times as many adult salmon and grilse, small salmon, were taken in the sets. There was 3 times more adult salmon taken in sets with lights than without lights. And so very quickly, the next year, 1966, the use of lights on fish boats was prohibited in areas of the BC coast. In 1988, the salmon farms arrived in the Broughton Archipelago. The community of Echo Bay and myself, we all thought they were a good idea. We thought they would take pressure off the wild salmon. We thought they would bring families to our community because we had one of the last one-room schools in Canada. And we welcomed the industry. In fact, I offered to talk to women that were thinking of moving out there to work on the farms in case they wondered what it was like to raise children in a remote place with no road access, no ferries, no phones, no electricity. And but very quickly we realized that the farms were going into the wrong places. And it wasn't me that realized this because I was too new to the place to really understand where the fish were. But my fishermen neighbors came to me and asked me to start writing letters to DFO to say, hey, you're putting these where the herring are schooling, the salmon are schooling, the rock cod, the prawns are. In particular, those 4 species were being impacted just by the siting of the farms right on top of them. And the farms began to use these lights. And right from the beginning, the fishermen were like, hey, well, wait a minute. We're not allowed to use lights because it attracts fish. Even DFO fisheries officers that came out to Echo Bay and saw the lights were on at night made comments like, hey, we thought that wasn't allowed. They were confused. And the fishermen and local people thought that the farms were turning the lights on to actually feed their fish. So it would attract young fish and the farm fish would gain weight without needing pellets. But the farmers said that they used them to stop the Atlantic salmon from maturing. They just wanted them to get bigger and fatter. They didn't want them to start to sexually mature and grow the big kypes and grow eggs because that reduced the quality of the fish, and I think it also reduced the size of the fish. But for a long time, this debate went on, and the farmers just won, hands down. We were not allowed to look in the farms. DFO, after their initial shock, they went along with it. And so it was a point of contention for a long time. Well, in 2016, the Sea Shepherd Society lent me a boat, the Martin Sheen, a big, beautiful sailboat. And we traveled in that boat to all the farms along eastern Vancouver Island and eventually around the entire island and put divers down. And the first thing I noticed was the amount of herring that were outside the farms. This is a school of herring on the left, and you can see the nets, the fish farm nets on the right. You know, what are these fish doing around the pens? They clearly had become comfortable with them. So here you see 3 herring that are traveling back and forth outside of the outer net. They're just swimming through the predator net, but you can see there's a smaller mesh net behind them, and that's what's actually containing the farm salmon. In 2017, when First Nations and myself occupied the salmon farms for 280 days, I was constantly handing people GoPro cameras on poles just to get a look at what is going on inside the farms. And again, there were the herring. They were not only outside the farms, they were inside the farms. So here's a big Atlantic salmon, and the herring are skittering around over top. Every single farm, every single pen, each farm has up to 12 pens, had large schools of herring. There were times where you just couldn't see through the herring to the fish farms. And so it became apparent that the fish farms were also herring farms. They are the biggest herring fishery on this coast because it happens 365 days a year. And we don't really know what happens to these fish that get in the farms. I'm hoping to be able to learn more about this because the First Nations of the Broughton Archipelago have won the authority to look at what's going on in these farms and make some changes. And they're getting rid of the farms, a few every year. So here you can see an Atlantic salmon is actually chasing these herring. The herring are, all the footage I've seen of the herring in the farms, they're darting around. They are constantly in an evasive. But one of the things I noticed is it's not all the farm salmon that are chasing them. Most of the farm salmon appear to completely ignore them. They're just big, docile fish going around in a circle. But in many of the pens, there were these smaller, more feral, maybe you could say throwbacks. They have more wild tendencies, and they were chasing the fish around. In fact, we got a few shots of the Atlantic salmon actually striking at the herring, and you can see this is a small Atlantic salmon, but he's coming up after these herring, and quite a few herring had bite marks on them and rake marks. And so there is some concern that the salmon in the pens are feeding on these herring, which could also be seen as a fishery. Due to the laws of Canada, when the herring are in the farms, the government doesn't actually, or the courts don't actually see them as being captured because they say it's the same ocean inside the pen as outside the pen. But what happens to those fish inside the pens still remains somewhat of a mystery. My bigger concern, bigger than the thought that these Atlantics might be eating some of them, is disease transmission. Because salmon farms are feedlots, and feedlots break all the natural laws that control disease. They put them in a small space, they feed them an artificial diet, they're monoculture, so all the fish are very, very similar genetically, and nobody's allowed to migrate. And probably most importantly, there's no predators allowed in. Because salmon in the wild have a predator on them from the moment that the egg leaves the mother's body. So when they're spawning, any egg that bounces down the river, boom, it's gone by a trout or one of those little water ouzels, the birds, the dippers that run underwater. And then as the fish grow, there's kingfishers after them, and loons and grebes, and then eventually it's the killer whales and the grizzly bears and the eagles. And without these predators, what happens in the farms is the fish that are infected can become sick. And then they remain contagious for a long period of time, much longer than would happen in the wild. There was a period of time here in about 2016 where so many herring outside the farms had this bleeding out from under the scales. And we never did figure out what was the problem. The fish would appear on the surface, panicked, going around in circles like they were unable to dive, on their sides, spinning around, and the birds were picking them up, which makes you wonder, are they spreading this, whatever it is? And it just went on and on. Whenever I see a big disease event in wild fish, at this point, my first question is, did this come from the salmon farms? And the problem is we're never able to really get into the farm to answer that question. And so I'm hoping to resolve that now. But the spreading of disease from these farms is a huge issue. It's catastrophic for salmon. And in the Broughton Archipelago, commercial fishing was shut down just before I arrived in about 1982. And the herring populations have just continued to nosedive. They're still there, but they're not coming back. And so the beaches are still there. We don't have any big developments in the Broughton other than the farms. There's fewer people than there ever was, for the last 10,000 years. And so my question always goes to, is it disease? Is it entrapment? Is it disruption of their life cycle by these farms that is causing the decline of the herring? This is a picture inside a fish farm off Defino, the creative salmon farm. And this herring has a huge open sore. I mean, possibly this is a fish strike, and the salmon has removed the skin of the fish, but there is a disease in these farms called mouth rot, which is very rampant, which causes sores just like that. And then sea lice. So every salmon farm on this coast, like I said, is also a herring farm now. And so the herring are being condensed in there and trapped and staying in one place. And whether they can get out or not, I'm not really sure, but I know that they're in there. And that means that these sea lice have an extraordinary opportunity to spread. Because sea lice, you see these little pink tails on the louse in the middle. That's just a whole string of eggs, like little hockey pucks all strung together, and they hatch right off the mother louse. And then they have to swim around for a couple of days before they grow the equipment to grab a fish. So in the wild, as fish are moving continuously, these larval lice, most of them never find a fish. But where everybody's going around in a circle, it would appear that more and more of these lice are finding a host. And so these types of outbreaks of sea lice on juvenile salmon have never been reported on this coast. Nobody's ever seen them. There's been, like I said, a lot of work was done in the early years on herring. There was a lot of concern. People recognized they were a valuable fish. And if people had seen herring like this, it certainly would have made it into the literature. So this is new. Now, over the years, going back on the Martin Sheen, I asked the divers to really try to concentrate on these herring. Like, what were they doing? Were they just attracted to the structure or something else about the location? But here you can see these fish are going right up to the net. And one of the things I noticed is on these GoPros you can hear underwater. And when they turn on their feeders, the pellets are rolling down these long black plastic tubes that are floating in the water. And so you can hear that, and so can the herring. And so when everything's quiet, the herring were just milling around. But as soon as you could hear those pellets going down the tubes, all the herring were orienting right to the pens. Now, the pellets are too big for these herring. But as the pellets are rolling down the tube, pieces of them are breaking off. And if you are at a fish farm, like at sunset or sunrise where the light's low, you can see this whole cloud of dust that is coming out of these blowers that they're blowing the pellets with. And in this case, you can see this herring has his gills flared out. Here's another close-up. I know these are a bit blurry, but they're really big enlargements of GoPro shots. But this fish is clearly feeding. And you can see lots of little bits in the water. So until somebody can tell me otherwise, it's my view that they are attracted to these farms. They are now addicted to the feed. They're feeding on it. And I don't know what happens to these fish when the farms are harvested and they go fallow for a few months. Do these little herring know how to go out and be herring? Do they know how to catch the zooplankton that they're supposed to be eating? Are they infected to the point where they're not living their full life cycle and spawning? Something is going very wrong with them because they just continue to decline. And now we have this lovely return of humpback whales, but honestly, I look at all the humpback whales out here and I'm like, oh, guys, could you just give these herring a break for a few years and let them rebuild now that the fish farms are being removed? Of course, the humpbacks aren't listening to me. But I think it's very important that people realize that where there are herring, there is hope. On this coast, if you have herring, you have the underpinnings of this vibrant ecosystem. You get salmon, you get whales, you feed the eagles. And so we're working very hard to try to get the lights turned off on these farms and just to get the farms out of the water. There's just no way these farms can comply with the natural laws and allow these ecosystems to thrive. So I'm always surprised that the herring fishermen aren't more concerned about what is going on with the herring in the farms. I've tried to make this public. I've broadcast the photographs. I've sent them to the fishermen. But there seems to be a tolerance for this interaction between the herring and the fish farms that I think is detrimental. And I hope very much that, well, the Broughton will be an experiment. They are getting rid of the farms. It's a beautiful, discrete ecosystem. And we'll see what happens to the herring, and we'll see what happens to the salmon, and then we will know the true cost of salmon farming. So consider yourselves very lucky that you still have herring spawning down there. It is certainly a gift, and I appreciate all the efforts that you are making to ensure that that spawn continues. So thanks so much.